Hello out there, all my bookish friends out there in booktube land, and welcome to another episode of Tristan and the Classics. In this episode, we're taking a look at 8 classic works of literature which the critics thought were rubbish when they came out. And by means of this, we're going to see that being intellectual is not what makes something classic, and if you don't like a particular classic when you read it, it doesn't mean to say there's something deficient with you or you're not a very good reader. So, without further ado, let's take a look at these 8 classics which some critics thought were just hogwash. First up on our list is a book that is going to surprise you because it is one of the great classics of American literature. In fact, Ernest Hemingway said that before this book there were no American books and afterwards there are none, and it is Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Would you believe that this received such strong attacks by the critics when this was first released? I'm just going to read you, I've printed out some quotes. I'm going to read you just one quote about Huckleberry Finn, or a review. It says, "The Concord Public Library Committee deserve well of the public by their action in banishing Mark Twain's new book, Huckleberry Finn, on the ground that it is trashy and vicious." It is time that this influential pseudonym should cease to carry into homes and libraries unworthy productions. The advertising samples of this book, which have disfigured the Century magazine, are enough to tell any reader how offensive the whole thing must be. They're no better in tone than the dime novels which flood the blood and thunder reading population. His literary skill is, of course, superior, but their moral level is low, and their perusal cannot be anything less than harmful. Now, that was from the Springfield Republican, who wrote that, and was actually put into the New York Times as an opinion piece. It's quite funny. I love the trashy and vicious. I love it when someone gets passionate about their reviews. And lo and behold, this book has lasted and outlasted many, if not most, of other American works. But what does it tell you? Actually, I think this tells you the danger of criticising a book not necessarily on its merits, but because you don't like its morals. You don't like its subject matter. We all have biases, but be careful not to judge a book purely because you don't like the bias, the morality. Judge it on its own merits. The second book on our list could surprise you, but maybe in the day you can understand why it received some criticism, and it is Emily Bronte's Withering Heights, a book of extraordinary passion and force and power. But how it was received by the public was quite amusing, particularly the more genteel of the public. Of course, it's very windswept and, full of cruelty and angst and anger and certain viciousness. But listen to this one review from Graham's Ladies magazine in 1848. "How a human being could have attempted such a book as the present without committing suicide before he had finished a dozen chapters is a mystery. It is a compound of vulgar depravity and unnatural horrors." Oh, I love the vehemence inside that. How can't you commit suicide when reading it or writing it? Spectacular. And so, of course, they would have written that off as trashy literature, and lo and behold, 100 and almost 80 years later, this is still amongst favourites of books. Even compared to popular novels, this is still amongst the favourites of many readers. So, just because you're a critic doesn't mean you always know what you're talking about. The third classic we're going to talk about is another great classic of American literature, which particularly American critics didn't like. They thought it was absolute tosh. And it is, of course, Moby Dick. Not only Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, but Moby Dick and Grapes of Wrath by Steinbeck. They all came in for terrible criticism. Just listen to what was said about this. It was received quite well in Britain, but in America, this was from the New York United States magazine. "Mr. Melville is evidently trying to ascertain how far the public will consent to be imposed upon. He is gauging at once our gullibility and our patience. Having written 1 or 2 passable extravagances, he has considered himself privileged to produce as many more as he pleases, increasingly exaggerated and increasingly dull, in bombast, in caricature, in rhetorical artifice, generally as clumsy as it is ineffectual. and in low attempts at humour, each one of his volumes has been an advance among its predecessors. Mr. Melville never writes naturally. His sentiment is forced, his wit is forced, and his enthusiasm is forced. And in his attempts to display to the utmost extent his powers of fine writing, he has succeeded, we think, beyond his most sanguine imaginations. We have no intention of quoting any passages just now from Moby Dick. The London journals, we understand, have bestowed upon the work many flattering notices, and we should be loth to combat such high authority. But if there are any of our readers who wish to find examples of bad rhetoric, involved syntax, stilted sentiment, and incoherent English, we will take the liberty of recommending to them this precious volume of Mr. Melville's. Now, what's so funny about that review is that's how so many people today still see Moby Dick. And I want to make a really important point here. If that's how you feel about Moby Dick, you're not alone. This was a literature critic who wrote it. Maybe not a fully rounded critic, thinking of the history of criticism in America. I don't mean that derogatorily, but if you analyse critics of the day. But nonetheless, it goes to show, just because you don't like a book that's held as a great classic doesn't mean to say there's something deficient in you. Actually, I give them 5 out of 5 for the writing. It's particularly polemic against poor Melville. And you probably know Melville's work wasn't popular in his own time. It was rediscovered later. Oh, just to say, another review of Moby Dick just had this lovely sentence to say. It says, the ideas of a connected and collected story has obviously visited and abandoned its writer again and again in the course of composition. So there's bits of story and then he wanders off. I just love how some people review books. The fourth book on our list, which was criticised upon its release, is the groundbreaking and hugely popular 1984 by George Orwell, which has proved to be extremely prescient and inventive in imagination. Yet not everyone particularly liked it when it came out. Some jumped to its defence. Others, well, like Edward Shanks, said this about it when he reviewed it for the Sunday Times. He said, "It breaks all records for gloomy vaticination." Vaticination, that's somewhere between prognosis and prophecy. You know, he's like, oh, people guessing the future, and this is the gloomiest of the lot. Someone else said, and I love this one, commie baiting at a level the Sun would find embarrassing. The Sun is a tabloid newspaper, not known for its refinement, its elegance, its sort of, you know, very shotgun through the forehead kind of news and quite right-hand leaning. So to say that this is commie baiting is quite funny, beyond what the Sun can do. And of course, well, they've proved to be quite wrong about this. This has endured to the point that many, many people can see what Orwell was getting at, and many people say that we are beginning to see the development of the society he created in here. So, yeah, not all reviewers are right. The next book on our list is probably actually going to surprise you quite a lot. And it's another brilliant American piece of literature. Like, this defines a nation to many respects. And it's F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, which didn't do well when he released it. Now listen to what the Chicago Tribune said very knowingly about this book. Scott Fitzgerald's new novel, The Great Gatsby, is in form no more than a glorified anecdote, and not too probable at that. This story is obviously unimportant, and though, as I shall show, it has its place in the Fitzgerald canon, it is certainly not to be put on the same shelf with, say, This Side of Paradise. What ails it, fundamentally, is the plain fact that it's simply a story. That Fitzgerald seems to be far more interested in maintaining its suspense than in getting under the skins of its people. Well, that's all very knowing of the critic, but it makes you wonder, this highlights a problem actually in academic circles. There's a lot of trying to pin things down on what is proper form, proper art, and modernism is in full swing here, modernist writing, and it doesn't comport with that. It's actually a straightforward story, but that's its beauty. It didn't catch hold in America straight away, but it's been appreciated later by excellent readers and the public at large, and there is a depth hidden within this story, a real depth, a sort of primal state that we recognise. The end of the book is phenomenal in getting to the point that Fitzgerald is trying to put across. I have to share with you one more very prescient and wise saying about this book, anticipating how good it is, by again the Springfield Republican review. Little slack, a little soft, more than a little art. A little slack, a little soft, more than a little artificial. The Great Gatsby falls into the class of negligible novels. I mean, how wide of the mark can you be? It actually highlights the point that trying to guess what will be a classic is impossible. Only time really tells. But I love it when, again, my point being, if you don't like a book, it doesn't mean to say you're wrong. Even critics who, let's argue, read quite a lot, they don't all like every book that's called a classic. And they can be a million miles wide of the mark about its impact on posterity. The next classic on our list arguably could be called the most influential classic on this list and has the shortest review, just one sentence. And it's Gustave Flaubert's Madame Bovary. This kick-started the modernist movement. It changed literature in many respects, and loads of critics praised it on its release. But Le Figaro, the French newspaper, decided to take a different tack and gave this beautiful summary of Madame Bovary. Monsieur Flaubert is not a writer. That's it. This is rubbish. Now, it made me wonder why they said that. Well, it was different in its day. If you come at a book with too many preconceived notions of what should be good literature, literature will always break them. And so this is where there is some who call there a pomposity in classics. It's those who are so dogmatic about these things. And to say that Flaubert is not a writer and then he practically changes the world of literature through his works is quite funny, really, in my opinion. But I love that. So to the point, Monsieur Flaubert is not a writer. Our next classic is one I am sure is going to surprise you that it received so much criticism on its release. Although many people praised it, it had quite a cohort of critics against it, and it's none other than J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, amongst the most beloved of classic works, and the spawner of the fantasy world genre, really. I mean, it really got the medieval fantasy thing on its feet. But listen to a couple of these comments about one of them, so strident, I love it. Right, so Edmund Wilson writes in 1956, so straight after its release, in an article called Ooh, Those Awful Orcs, he said, Tolkien's work is juvenile trash. And said Dr. Tolkien has little skill at narrative and no instinct for literary form. Actually, again, this points something out. Trying to nail down a classic by means of literary form, technique, style, all that kind of stuff is always broken in literature. Never do it. And if you approach a book with preconceived ideas about what literature should be, then you're going to make calamitous errors of judgment, like calling this juvenile trash. Although he's got every right to feel it's juvenile trash, if that's how he thinks. But nonetheless, shows the critic was way off. More people said, this is another writer, he says, all the characters are boys masquerading as adult heroes and will never come to puberty. Hardly one of them knows anything about women. I suppose he's right in many respects, but it shows that that's not necessarily what makes a great book. Catherine Stimpson, she really raged against Tolkien. She said that he was an incorrigible nationalist and peopled his writing with irritatingly, blandly, traditionally masculine, one-dimensional characters, and they engage in sort of living a bourgeois pastoral idyll. Now, there are other critics that wrote back responding to these comments and arguing the opposite, and it's quite interesting to read. But this book, The Lord of the Rings, seems to have been, well, there was quite a rumpus over this amongst the literary elites. And yet it stood the test of time. That's what makes a classic, is whether it stands the test of time. If you want to know more about classics, go and watch my video, Harry Potter, is it a classic or will it be a classic? Because we're talking there about one of the most interesting concepts of what makes a classic, which I think is the closest thing to the truth. The next classic and penultimate one on our list is another tremendously powerful American classic. In fact, it's so powerful that it's called the American novel, and yet it came in for such criticism. It is John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. People were burning this book, which, Steinbeck couldn't have minded because it was making him money. They had to buy it first. And people wanted it banned. And it actually shows that certain cultural mores have a bigger influence on how books are perceived than actually their real value. Just listen to this one somewhat personal remark about Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. The arguments are selected from the customary communistic sources and arguments. Consistency is not, and any informed reader knows that it cannot be, a quality either of the communistic mind or communistic propaganda. So, I do spot the deep flaw in this element of criticism. When people are politically persuaded and begin to see their biases in everything, they become the least trustworthy of critics, which is why you should be so careful about what critics say about books. There is nothing here, and of course I've took it slightly, it's not out of context, but I haven't got the context around it. But his argument is all about it being communist, and it's not. That's the thing about it. It's just they felt he was threatening the idea of the American dream. But he was just writing a good story like Steinbeck does, with deep insights into motivations and people and habits. Other criticism is more fair of this, even in the negative, but that, well, is certainly way off the mark. And that's where, you see, when worldviews get into academia, it devalues academia's reasonableness in judgment, its level of or ability to judge. So now we're at the very last of the classics that got some negative press by critics when they came out, and I've saved this one till last because it's just remarkable. It is none other than the complete works of Shakespeare. I'm laughing not because I don't believe someone can criticise Shakespeare. If you don't like him, you don't like him, that's fine. But what it highlights is how unreliable intellectual critics can be, how wide of the mark people can be. This guy, his works have lasted centuries and are still the most acted plays around the whole world, and people enjoy them, even without any education or background education on Shakespeare. But our culprit here is another dramatist who lived at the same time as Shakespeare, called Robert Greene. He studied in Cambridge, got his MA from Cambridge University, and he made this, in fact this is what he's most famous for in his life now. He says, "There is an upstart crow, beautified with our feathers, that with his tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide, supposes he is as well able to bombast out a blank verse as the best of you, and, being an absolute Johannes factotum, is in his own conceit the only shake scene in a country." This is just great. First of all, upstart crow, fantastic line, I've got to give him credit for that. He makes a subtle insinuation here to Shakespeare by quoting a line from one of the Henriade plays, which is this tiger's heart wrapped in a player's or a woman's hide. And he calls him a Johannes factotum. He's a jack of all trades, but he's not a master. He's glorified with our feathers, the intellectuals. We're the ones who write the best. We do the best blank verse. This Shakespeare guy hasn't got an education, didn't go to university, so he's got to be rubbish. It's rather personal. And maybe on a technical aspect, you could argue he might be right. Christopher Marlowe is known to write better blank verse than Shakespeare, but no one gets the human like Shakespeare. That's why the others die out and Shakespeare's works continue to resonate down to this day. So it just goes to show, if we approach literature thinking that in some way it's one thing's more valuable than other based on our biases, or because we have set an arbitrary criteria, because there is no single criteria to pin down what will become a classic, then our opinion, that's when people veer off to the pompous. Okay. It's not wrong to have an opinion. I just thought this was quite a light-hearted review of some criticisms of classic books. And if you would like, please let me know in the comments. Would you like to have another video discussing the 5 to 10 most popular myths about classics? Because a lot of people are put off by pomposity. And there's a lot of people with wrong ideas about the classics, and maybe you have them, or maybe you'd like to know how to answer them. If that sounds like a video you want to hear, then let me know. If you know of any other great criticism of classics, write it down in the comments below, and let's all have a little titter over it, shall we? So, be sure to do the subscribe thingy, and if you really want to help my channel, share it. Please press the little share button, it's like an arrow or a split, I can't remember now, underneath the video, and WhatsApp it to someone, or even better, put it in a Facebook group, community, whatever. That really helps my channel if you want to do something for me and want to help me keep producing this content. Until the next time, I wish you joy in whatever you decide and enjoy reading.